One might say that people construct their reality and develop their activities according to their ideas of the real, of what they consider to be good or bad, normal and abnormal. In this sense, deaf people began to build their own deaf cultural community with their own rules and informal goals. To be a part of the deaf cultural community, it is necessary that the individual identify himself with the deaf world, sharing experiences, participating in the activities of his community, exposing a clear notion of belonging to the group. But as in any other group, there are rules to access it, fundamental to promote and to maintain cohesion. It is necessary to share goals through the development of a set of shared norms and values, structuring their collective action, and acquiring conscience of themselves as individual members of the group. Identification with deaf cultural community makes their members relate more easily with deaf people than with hearing people, whatever their condition is and wherever they live. Arrived at this point, we would like to address very briefly deafness as a construct. So deafness can be characterized as a historical constructed difference and a potential linguistic minority. The social anthropological approach converts deafness into a phenomenon of social difference that in turn leads to different socialization processes. This cultural view is the source for the rejection of the diagnosis of hearing impairment and the label of auditory disability. In addition, we can argue that the rejection of being labeled hearing impaired doesn't mean denying being deaf. Their inability to learn through auditory processes is replaced by their ability to understand the world visually. The deaf have a clearly different communication system in comparison to hearing people. They use sign language, a communication based on visual spatial elements, very different from the oral communication based on audition. But communication is not only language, it is everything we do when we interact with others. It is impossible not to communicate. Even when we are quiet and avoiding eye contact, we are communicating our need to be left alone. Deaf culture can be located in adaptive, non-integrative strategies in dealing with the hearing world, and in convivial norms, frequently much more rigid and less tolerant. Probably, these strategies and norms result from the survival instinct of any cultural community that feels threatened. Take for instance deaf housing. They are characterized by the existence of good lighting to allow people to constantly see each other. Another example is the placement of the tables in the classrooms. They are organized in circles so that everybody sees each other's face. Deaf culture is therefore a culture of adaptation to the difference and the promoter of social relations. Only those that try to interpret the dynamics of a deaf cultural community by the comprehension of all the variables that involve their culture can access the deeper meaning of this fascinating phenomenon of the deaf adaptation to a perceived hostile environment. We have no doubt today that the greatest difference between deaf and hearing people exists precisely in the auditory system. However, no difference has been found between deaf and listeners on their cognitive abilities. Nevertheless, we can find many examples demonstrating that individuals deprived of contact with their peers and fellows develop serious cognitive disabilities, hindering their adaptation and not reaching an harmonious development that allows them to acquire the necessary skills to live autonomously as persons. You can also say that through the construction of deafness as solely only a hearing impairment, the valorization of the hearing model was reflected. During oralism in deaf education, this hearing model was imposed on deaf people and their culture to disguise the difference between deaf and hearing. In this way, deafness was made invisible. Nowadays, deaf cultural community is more often referred to as a cultural minority. Like every cultural minority, they have to adapt to the dominant cultural codes of the majority in a society. However, some cultural minorities have been given special rights in order to maintain their heritage, language, and culture. In the past, during the oralistic discourse, mainstreaming deaf students was the goal. Some say that this discourse is still alive. Oralism and mainstreaming can be understood as imposing the cultural code of the hearing majority on the deaf minority, downgrading the values and norms of the deaf. In the discourse about the benefits of oralism, this becomes apparent, as equalizing is used as a pro-mainstreaming argument. Truthfully, deaf will never become normal or equal, because they are different. This so-called clash between hearing and deaf is often recreated day by day to ignore and silence an essential cultural difference. As the problem of the deaf is located in an individual body, medical taxonomy is applied, perpetuating interpretations of deafness as a loss, a disability, or an impairment. Although deafness and other impairments are not considered diseases threatening mankind, medicine is still triggered to find a final solution for these adverse physical conditions. In this, the situation of the deaf is different from other cultural minorities based on race and gender. Within this fighting for the right to be different, this is an affirmative policy in favor of deaf culture, we can still detect in schools, although at a smaller scale, the power of oralism, either in the minds of those who still believe, or worse, in everyday practices. If politics still pursues integration of the deaf in mainstream education without respecting the difference in words and actions, the deaf could still feel excluded, while formally included. Such an educational policy is discriminatory, discontinuous, and an anachronism, and leads to a permanent practice of exclusion. Such a school is a space where we find strategies to transform the deaf into hearing, a place where deafness is disguised. From that perspective, deaf would always be inferior, always disadvantaged, always trying to adapt to the conditions of the hearing. In this political fight for the rights to be different and treated as such, deaf organizations play an important role. We will now list some of these main associations in Portugal, and we will discuss some of their views on deafness. In Portugal, we can find two types of deaf organizations. First, various local deaf associations, represented by the Portuguese Federation of Deaf Associations, that convenes the various associations in their common interest of speaking with one single voice. Portugal is also one of the countries represented at the European Union of the Deaf, founded in 1985 and situated in Brussels. Through this joint venture, they hope to get a more powerful position in the political fight to be different. Apart from these organizations, also parent organizations were set up to have a greater impact on the lives of the deaf population. One of them is the Association of Parents for the Education of Children with Hearing Impairments, which departments are private, non-profit institutions of welfare and social solidarity, founded by a group of parents with the aim of promoting the rehabilitation and education of children and youngsters with hearing impairments. They depend essentially on the fees paid by the members, donations, and governmental support. Both organizations are members of the European Federation of Parents for the Education of the Hearing Impaired, of which the Portuguese Association was a founding member. Also, the parents of children with cochlear implants have formed a Portuguese Association for the Support of Cochlear Implants in 1997, with the goal of representing and defending the legitimate interests of people with hearing impairments and cochlear implants. The concepts of culture and of belonging to the deaf cultural community are closely tied to the idea of their own language, of their own meeting spaces, and cultural and recreational events. With the constitutional recognition of Portuguese Sign Language, the research and reflection about themes as culture, community, and identity increased incredibly. In some research, the deaf cultural community reacts against the qualification of hearing impaired, stating that the deaf are different, using a different kind of speech, namely sign. Therefore, the deaf possess their own language. This is sign language, which empowers them to participate in conversations. Deaf cultural community likes to be regarded as a group of persons who live in a particular area, share common goals, and work to attain those goals. This community may include persons that are not deaf, but who actively support the goals of the community. To be a part of the deaf cultural community means, first of all, to have some identification with the deaf world, namely with language, but also to develop a set of shared norms and values, to participate in the activities and events of the community, and to share common experiences. Deaf associations in Portugal show a great effort to keep alive the concepts of culture and community. Other than promoting a set of significant events to stress these ideas, they make an effort to organize activities for and with the general population, to share their identity and specific ways of thinking and being. We are talking about hundreds of seminars, conferences, publications, and so many other initiatives to disseminate the sign language. In this way, associations like to show that coming from a situation where the deaf were marginalized, being excluded from the political decision-making process for centuries, they are now heading towards recognition of a juridical status of being different. The deaf are not only different, but they are going through a different socialization process, in which sign language plays a significant role. As such, they form a linguistic and cultural minority, where deafness is normal and not pathological. Furthermore, it is stressed that the deaf cultural community shares a deaf awareness ideology that is the collective conscience of deaf people, inscribing meaning to deafness as being proud of their language and culture. In particular, the rise of the deaf awareness ideology represents the cultural and political defense against the pathological labeling of deaf people. As we stated, this cultural vision of deafness in Portugal made the deaf community reject the diagnosis of diminished hearing and the immediate label of hearing impaired. The expressions deaf and deafness are clearly preferred because they don't suggest, in linguistic terms, a disability. These only label a group and their common denominator. The deaf community reacts against the qualification of impaired, stating that the deaf person is a different person, with their own language, Portuguese Sign Language, as a natural linguistic system of its community.